Over 80 years ago, the world changed forever. In just 4 years, over 70 million people lost their lives in a global war that was fought on land, on the CSN, even in outer space. Well, after the First World War, the treaty that ended the war placed blame for the war on Germany, and they were forced to give up all of their overseas colonies. They were also heavily restricted in their military capabilities and were forced to pay back the costs of the war. There was the Triple Entente, which consisted of France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, which consisted of Germany. By 1943, the Germans were being pushed back on all fronts. In the east, the Soviets were advancing further and further west. In the south, the British and Americans had landed in North Africa and were pushing towards the German border. And in the west itself, the Allies were steadily making gains against the Germans. Hitler's health was also deteriorating, and he became increasingly erratic as the war went on. On April 30th, 1945, as the Soviet troops closed in on his bunker, he took his own life. Germany would surrender just 6 days later. As the war progressed, more and more countries would join the fight. In the Pacific, the Japanese had taken a large part of Southeast Asia and were even threatening Australia itself. But with the help of the United States, the Australians were able to hold off the Japanese. In 1944, the Americans would take back the Philippines and begin the long process of retaking the Pacific Islands that the Japanese had seized. The Japanese fought fiercely, but they were eventually pushed back to their home islands. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, they dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. Japan would surrender on September 2, 1945, ending World War II. Japan would enter the war on the side of Germany, as well as the countries of Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. It was a war that changed the world and had far-reaching consequences that are still felt today. So remember the fallen and learn from the past so that we can build a better future. That is 1 minute. See you next time. But it was the Soviet Union that would end up dealing the death blow to Poland. While the Germans had taken the western part of the country, the Soviets had taken the eastern part. Between the two of them, Poland was no more. The German people were angry at the treaty and the world powers who had imposed it on them. And so in 1933, when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party took control of Germany, one of their first acts was to pull Germany out of the treaty. Hitler believed that the treaty was unfair and that Germany should not have to pay for the costs of the war. He also believed that the Germans were a superior race and that they had the right to expand their territory into other European countries. This led to a rapid rearmament of Germany, and in just 2 years, they had the largest army in Europe with over 500,000 men. It was a war that pitted the powers of Europe against each other, and it was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It was World War II. But how did this all start? But this did not stop Hitler. In 1938, he annexed Austria into Germany and then set his sights on the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Once again, Hitler's forces marched into the region and forced the Czechs to give up the area without a fight. This only encouraged him further, and soon he set his eyes on Poland. But before he could invade Poland, he needed to deal with France and Britain. Both countries had obligations to defend Poland and had threatened war if Germany invaded. But Hitler knew that these countries were unprepared for war, and he gambled that they wouldn't actually fight. He was right. On September 1, 1939, German troops crossed into Poland and began the invasion. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany, but they didn't do much to help Poland. Within just 2 weeks, the Germans had taken over the entire country. Now, before the war, many countries had formed alliances. As the fighting continued, the Allies began to turn the tide of war against Germany, but the war would continue for another year. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, taking over 70 million lives.